Hey y'all, my name is Cassie and I am the creator of Pieces of Scrap, and in today's video we're going to be doing another free amigurumi pattern review video. These are of Instagram patterns that I found that are specifically fictional characters that appear in TV shows, movies, anything like that. So let's go ahead and get started. The first criteria that I use when I rate patterns is, would I use the pattern again? This really comes down to the level of difficulty associated with the pattern, if it would be easy for a beginner crocheter to understand versus like an advanced crocheter, somebody more who has more experience in working patterns, that sort of thing. Number two is, can I understand the pattern easily? This really comes down to how easy it is to understand what the pattern designer means in the instructions. And some examples of this are when there's lots of photos to demonstrate different steps and processes in the instructions that might be hard to follow, as well as diagrams that show you complicated things you might not be familiar with doing, as well as detailed and thorough instructions that tell you how to do stitches that you may not be familiar with. And number three is, do I like the finished product? And this really comes down to if it's a case of expectations versus reality, where the photos of the final product by the pattern designer don't come out looking like what yours comes out looking like. And you really want that consistency when it comes to making the pattern. So if you come back to it in the future because it's something you want to make for somebody or for market prep or something like that, you know exactly what you're expecting the product to come out looking like when it's finished. So the first pattern that I tested for this video is Pika the Mouse. This is a Lovey by willow.andwild, and this pattern was suggested to me by Cozy Hobbies Shell. So thank you so much for suggesting that pattern to me. It's a really easy pattern to work up, fairly low sew. I think the only things you have to sew on are these cheek red bits, the ears, the arms, and the tail. Everything else is no sew. So you work from the head, you single crochet directly into the head to create the body part, and then you crochet the legs directly into the body when you're finished, just by sectioning off specific stitches to crochet into and then sewing the bottom closed afterwards. So fairly simple design, and as loveys typically are made, you don't stuff the body or any of the pieces, so the body and the feet are kind of like squishy and nice to touch, and then the only thing that really gets stuffed is the head, and that's obvious just to keep that head shape looking correct. That being said, there isn't a note in the pattern to stuff the head, but I am almost 150% sure that you are supposed to stuff the head. Once you fasten off the head, it actually tells you to leave like a 6-inch tail, and I just thought that was a little bit too long. When I did see the 6-inch tail, I ended up fastening off a much longer tail because I was expecting that I would have to sew the head onto the body instead of working directly into the head to make the body. So yeah, I would definitely just, rather than saying like a certain length for a tail, if you're not sewing it to something else, just say something along the lines of, leave a tail long enough for you to sew the head closed, or something like that. Otherwise, you might just assume that you're using that tail for a different reason, and you might need it a little bit longer depending on your skill level with sewing. My final note is that the head shape of mine is a lot different than the head shape in their photos. In their photos, it's a lot rounder, more like a circle sphere shape instead of this more hexagonal shape. And this shape is actually more typical for a Pikachu. So that is why I think this is probably what it's normally supposed to look like. That being said, I think the pattern designer worked using Premier Parfait or similar size yarn, whereas this is a, I believe it's a chenille yarn by Premier Yarns, but it is like weighted kind of similarly to Bernat blankets, so it's a thicker weight, and definitely tension and your hook size, you have to cater that towards your yarn. And I think perhaps my hook size was a little bit too small for that head shape to be as spherical as it is in her pattern and in her pattern photos. So that could possibly be why my shape came out differently. However, I do prefer this head shape over the simple sphere because this looks more like Pikachu than hers does. I really liked the pattern. I really like how it turns out, and it was like a happy surprise for the head shape to come out so differently. And with that being said, I would give this pattern 4.5 stars out of 5. The next pattern that I reviewed for this video is the Baby Ogre, and this is a pattern by Appalachian Crochet, and it was suggested to me by Crochet by JJ the Boss. And this pattern is obviously supposed to be a Shrek, and so, or an ogre, specifically Shrek from the Shrek series of movies. And I think when I sewed my ears on, they're supposed to be like closer together and more at the top of the head rather than like the sides of the head. I think I just didn't really read the instructions about where you're specifically supposed to sew them on, so that is my bad. It's not supposed to be on the side as much, more on the top. However, I don't think it's a huge deal if you sew your ears on differently. Like if you prefer it like this and just make it like this every time, I don't think it should be a huge deal. The biggest thing is that consistency thing, and if you're going to do it differently than the pattern, maybe just make sure you know exactly how it's going to turn out every time if you're going to sell a bunch of them at once. That's not really a real note about the pattern, that's just more about how I didn't really follow instructions, so just kind of disregard that when you're thinking about whether or not you make this pattern. I just really wanted to point it out and point out that it's not a flaw in the pattern, it's just a flaw in me following instructions. Anyway, the only real thing of note, actually there's two things that I noted in the pattern. So the first thing is that there's just not work in progress photos throughout the pattern, and those are really helpful for difficult steps where you're not really sure what they're supposed to look like and things of that nature. Like I think the ears specifically would have been helpful to see some work in progress photos for those, just because it's a weird shape and you're not really used to what that's supposed to look like, and so that would be very valuable there to have some photos of that, as well as in the assembly section. I always think the assembly section is super important for having photos, just to make sure you have things placed correctly and you also have a visual reference about where things are supposed to go, in case you're like me and you have a hard time following written instructions. Finally, the last thing that I noticed was the nose is embroidered on, and I think that's kind of unnecessary. I think it would have been a little bit cooler to just have a bobble stitch for the nose instead of having to embroider it on. I wasn't expecting having to embroider on a nose, so that was just something upon preference. It's a little less sewing involved and a little less finessing to make it look right, and I'm not even really sure if it comes across very obviously as that being his nose. So yeah, some very minor notes for this pattern. I would give this pattern 4 stars out of 5. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is the Cheshire Cat, and this is a pattern by craftmeansart, and it was suggested to me by Quilted Cupcake. It is a pattern that came out fairly recently, and when I decided that I was doing a character pattern video, I wanted to include as many follower suggestions as possible, because it seems like that's one of the most popular themes in my follower suggestion file to be suggested to me. So here's this Cheshire Cat. I really love how it turned out. I will note that the pattern has hot pink and light pink as the colors, but I didn't have any hot pink, or at least I didn't have enough hot pink to make it. So I just went for purple instead of that hot pink color, and I think it still does the Cheshire Cat justice. I've seen some Cheshire Cats in pink and purple instead of pink and hot pink, so it's not a really huge deal. You could really make this in any color combination that you want. I thought the ear technique in this pattern was really unique, and I was not expecting how it was assembled. So the ears, you make 2 of these purple panels. It's just a triangle, basically a really wide triangle. You make 2 of those for each ear, and then you slip stitch them together to create the ear. And then after that, you embroider the inner ear color on. There isn't really a thorough instruction about how the embroidery is done from what I remember, but I think the reason that there's two panels of those ears is so that you can embroider without it showing through the back. That would be my guess why there's two. It's also very sturdy with there being two. They're like not really floppy ears, and it gives them a lot of structure so that they stand upright. It does add a little bit more time having to make two of those, slip stitch them together, and then embroider the pieces on. So if I was making the pattern, I would probably make it less sewing and embroidering just by making that all one piece for each ear so that you don't have to do it separately each time. I thought this pattern was really easy to make. It's your typical like loaf type of pattern, and then you have to make the ears, the little hair piece on the head, and your tail separately, and then obviously some embroidery. But other than that, it is pretty easy to make. It's very simple. It's a nice pattern, and I think it makes a really recognizable character. Like, people will definitely know that this is the Cheshire Cat, and definitely will draw some attention because of that. So yeah, super cute. Really liked this pattern. I would give it 5 stars out of 5. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is Jake in headphones. This is Jake from Adventure Time, and this pattern is by shine.crafts, and it was suggested to me by Madiiison. And I really like this pattern. It comes out really cute. This is actually my little sister who passed away 4 years ago. It was like one of her favorite shows growing up. I would always see her watching Adventure Time, and Jake was like one of her favorite characters. I remember her singing like the bacon pancake song a lot all the time. It was like her ringtone at one point in time. So it's really nice to have like a little reminder of my sister around, and this was a really quick and easy pattern to work up. It's really cute. You make the body, and to make the legs and the arms, I touched the arms and said legs. I don't know why I do that. It's just like brain disconnection there. Sorry about that. But anyway, you make them just by chaining off the body. So it's like a super simple way to create arms and legs. The leggy frog pattern does the same thing. So yeah, that made it a lot less sewing. You make the nose piece separately and then sew it on, and you make the headphones separately and sew them on. So I have 2 notes here. So the first note is that the muzzle, when you create it, it's made in a magic ring, and it tells you to slip stitch back into the first stitch of that magic ring. But I think if you did that, it would create a circle instead of this dog pug face, like kind of snout. If you were to slip stitch back into the first stitch of the magic ring, it would be a circle instead of creating this shape, which when I referenced all the photos in the pattern of the pattern testers as well as the pattern designers photos, they all look like this. They don't look like a circle with a slip stitch in the first stitch. So I opted to just ignore the slip stitch part and sew it on as is, and that's why mine looks like that. My next note is about the headphones. You make these 2 ear muffs separate, but the thing is, once you finish the second one, you don't chain off of it like you would assume to attach to the second one. And instead, it wants you to fasten off the second ear muff and then chain 10 separately with 2 long strands on either side of the chain, and then sew them into the headphones. That's a lot more steps than I think is necessary here. I think you should just simply, once you finish the second ear muff, chain 10 off of that one, slip stitch into the other headphone, and then fasten off, and you can use that long strand to sew the headphones on without having to add a lot more sewing by having to sew the strand onto each headphone separately. So yeah, that's kind of a minor note, but it saves you a lot of time if you do it that way, and I honestly don't know why that wasn't thought of when writing the pattern. The other things that I noticed about this pattern are more simple, like grammar or spelling issues. So for example, in one place it says beginning instead of beginning, and I also saw thighten instead of tighten, and I'm not sure why those things were missed because there were 8 testers for this pattern, and so I think the only way that those things could have been missed is if they were changed prior to releasing the pattern, and there wasn't a second round of reviews to make sure the pattern was 100% ready to go and be posted. And then my very last note about this is that my eyes appear farther apart than they appear in the final photos of her pattern, and I think it's mostly because her pattern uses a larger weight yarn. This is Premier Parfait Chunky, and I think hers uses more of a chenille chunky or a Bernat blanket to create the Jakin headphones. And so because of that, the muzzle is bigger in general, and the eyes appear to be closer together because of that. But to offset that in the future, I would just put the eyes closer together instead of being 6 stitches apart. Maybe I'd do 4. And with that being said, I would give this pattern 4.5 stars out of 5. That's another great pattern, super quick and easy, and it makes a very recognizable character that people will love and want to pick up. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is Hei Hei. This is a character from Moana, and it is a pattern by shaiinessu.studio. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's a little bit of a weird spelling, and it was suggested to me by Kimmy's Crochet 91, and it makes a really cute little derpy looking chicken. If you're unfamiliar with Hei Hei, he's from Moana, like I said, and he is kind of like a kind of mentally challenged rooster. He's really small and scrawny, and throughout the movie, he is like the comic relief. He does some silly things like trying to eat rocks, jumping into the ocean, stuff like that, and it's just a really cute character. The first thing of note with this pattern is that I think it's partially because of me stuffing him, but his head is kind of top heavy and he doesn't want to sit upright, and I think part of that is a pattern flaw. It doesn't tell you anywhere you should stuff the neck firmly to prevent from that, and also that also comes down to experienced crocheters should just know that. But anyway, I think it kind of adds to his character because, you know, Hei Hei in his character, in everything you know about him from Moana, he is a really silly chicken, and it probably doesn't surprise anybody that he does this, and that it could also be read as a dead chicken, unfortunately, because he just like kind of, his head just lolls. So that is one downside to that. But anyway, the pattern designer has a free version of this pattern as well as a paid version of this pattern. And the paid version of the pattern also has some extra face details, and I'm sure there's other details as well, to make it look a little bit closer to Hei Hei and how he appears in the movie. The next thing that I noticed was rows 1 through 12 don't have stitch counts, and this was a little bit of a issue with me because specifically in row 4 it doesn't make any sense unless the repeat is wrong. At the end of row 13 you should have 18 stitches if I counted correctly, and row 4 assumes that you should have 36 stitches to work into if that repeat is correct. I think the repeat is only meant to be 2 times, and the confusion that must have happened when the pattern designer wrote that row was that this row really defines the head shape, which is more of a square shape than a circle shape. So you're creating 4 corners of that head to create that squarish shape. And because of that, you should have 4 stitches total in the row with 3 single crochet increases in them. And because of that, there should only be 2 increases in this row because each repeat has 2 3 single crochet increases in them already. So I think that's why it was mixed up, because the pattern designer was probably thinking, I need 4 corners, but she wasn't thinking about the fact that she already had 2 corners made in the first repeat. So just making sure that repeat is correct is a big deal, especially if you don't have the stitch count listed in every row.
Hey guys, I just wanted to point out real quick that in the description of the pattern there is a correction, and it is as I thought. The direction to single crochet 3 times in the same stitch, then single crochet 3, and then single crochet 3 times in the same stitch again, and then for single crochet you're only supposed to repeat that twice total, which makes a lot more sense and I'm glad that a correction was added to the description of the pattern.
The next thing that I noticed was in the comb and tail section, the instructions point to the wrong piece to tell you what color they should be, but it says that the comb should be green and the tail should be red, but I think they should be the same color as the area that they're being sewed onto, and if that is right, the comb should be red and the tail should be green, so those two should be reversed. The other thing that I noticed about that comb and tail area of the pattern was that it doesn't tell you that you were working in the row instead of the round there. So if I was unfamiliar to crochet and I knew that we were working in the round earlier in the pattern, I would have a lot of issue trying to make that area work, specifically because it doesn't differentiate how that is made compared to the rest of the pattern. Lastly, I thought the feet instructions were very confusing and could have been written a little bit better. It tells you to chain 10, bobble, and fasten off, but there's no instruction to turn at the end of that chain and make the bobble in which specific stitch. So for example, typically when you make a chain, you will turn and work into the second chain from the hook, but it doesn't say that anywhere. It just says chain 10, bobble, fasten off. And then the other thing about making that bobble on a chain and fastening off is if you don't slip stitch back into that chain somewhere, that bobble's just going to be open on one side, and I don't think that's what she intended in the pattern when she wrote it. After that instruction, it tells you to insert the chain on row 21, bobble on the first stitch, fasten off, and weave in the end. And at this point, you already have one bobble on the leg, already signifying that foot at the end of the chain. I think that's what the bobble is supposed to be there for, is to be the feet. But having a bobble at the top of the chain where you're supposed to be attaching to the body, I think would look a little bit weird. And I don't know if that's what she intended for it to look like, for there to be a bobble at the top and the bottom. The way that I understood this instruction would be to take the leg you had already made, put your hook through row 21 and the chain, then bobble into the first chain of the leg. I don't think that's right, but I'm not sure how else that could have been understood, being how it was written. What I did to improvise my legs was I did this twice. I chained 10, bobble into the second chain from the hook, slip stitched into the next chain, and then I fastened off with a long tail. Then I weaved that tail up the leg and tied it loosely to the foundation tail. After I did this, I realized another way you could do it was just to slip stitch up the chain and directly crochet into the leg and fasten off. That would probably be easier than the way that I did it, but I was trying to do it as closely as I can to what the pattern said without altering it significantly. That being said, I think this pattern needs a little bit of improvement to really perfect it and make it easy to understand, and because of that, I would give it 3 stars out of 5. The next pattern I reviewed for this video is Pooh. This is Winnie the Pooh, and it was a pattern made by V Santika Plushies, and it was suggested to me by madiiison. This is a really cute pattern, and actually I don't think it asks for you to embroider eyes, but that's just what I chose to do because I didn't have the correct size eyes to make this look right. I think the pattern designer used more oval shaped eyes instead of round circular ones, and that is why I opted to just embroider mine on. And I'm kind of becoming a sucker for the embroidered eyes. I really like how they turn out, and so I think in the future I might be embroidering more eyes on more of my plushies. So my first note about this pattern is that the eyes in the photo look closer than they actually say that they should be in the pattern. It tells you to place your eyes 8 stitches apart, but in the photos it looks like they're 6 stitches apart. So my eyes are 6 stitches apart, and it looks a little bit closer to what the pattern designer says it should look like instead of having it 8 stitches apart. Another note about having your stitch number in between the eyes is that you should say how many visible stitches should be in between the eyes instead of how many stitches total, because that can vary depending on your eye size. So for example, if you have a bigger eye, say it's like this big, it's going to cover more stitches than an eye that's about this big. And if you say that the stitches are 6 stitches apart and your eyes are this big, it's going to be closer together than it would be if your eye was this big. The eyes would be farther apart if they were smaller. My next note is that in the pictures, her ears look bigger than they actually come out to be. I know that she uses a different yarn weight than me. I think she uses a chenille yarn, like a much smaller chenille yarn than this is. And because of that, I'm just confused about the size of her ears. They look a little bit taller and maybe even a little bit wider. So I wonder if there was an extra row of single crochets in the ear that make them a little bit bigger that just wasn't included in the final pattern but was included in the final photos. Then my final note is just about having photos in the pattern. There's no work in progress photos throughout the pattern to show you difficult steps, especially the assembly section. I always think that's super important when you have to sew on pieces to the body, to have photos of maybe the final product or close-up photos of that area so that you know exactly where those pieces are being placed. With all that being said, I still think Pooh came out really cute, and I love the details of him, like having the very crisp color change here where it looks like he's actually wearing a shirt and having, instead of having that spiked edge. This is achieved by crocheting into either the front loops or back loops. I can never remember when I have to recall it, of the previous row when you do that color change to get that really crisp edge. So yeah, I always recommend doing that to get more of a clothing article transition instead of a, you know, more of a jagged transition that might just look like, you know, natural color changes on an animal's fur or something like that. So with all of that said, I would give this pattern 4 stars out of 5. It's another great one. I love how Pooh Bear comes out, and there's just some minor issues in the pattern that I think should be addressed in order to make it perfect. But I really love how he turned out, and I think he will be very popular at markets. The next pattern that I made for this video is a very large pattern, hence why I kind of scooted back a little, and it is Chansey. This is a Pokemon, and this pattern is by Cat Knit. It is a very time heavy pattern. This pattern took me over 4 hours to put together. The body is crocheted in one piece. You make this egg. I will address right away that I probably overstuffed the body, hence all these gappings in the stitches, and that's just because I'm not really used to having to stuff something so large. This is definitely the largest plushie I've ever crocheted in my life. Um, so I apologize ahead of time for the gapping. As you can see on like the egg and the arms and the pouch here and all of that, all of those minor details, the gapping is not as significant or really even noticeable at all. And I use the same hook size. Before I stuffed this big old body, that gapping was not occurring, but because I stuffed it probably a tad too much, it caused some gapping. Obviously at the bottom you can see that was probably what my tension was throughout the entire pattern before I stuffed it, and because I overstuffed it, there is a lot of gapping. I really apologize for that. It's really distracting to me, and I'm sure it's distracting to you guys as well. Anyway, I will kind of explain how this guy is made now. You make the body of the plushie from the bottom to the top. It's like a very large egg shape. You stuff it. It tells you to stuff the body firmly, hence I'm gonna keep reiterating how frustrated I am that I made him gap so much. Anyway, then you make the feet and the arms. They're essentially the same pattern but just in different colors. You make the egg, and it kind of detaches from the body, which is really cute, but also it makes him a little front heavy, so he doesn't like to sit up straight, which is kind of sad. And you make the pouch separately. You make 6 of these little hair pieces, and then you embroider the face on. I will set him down just because he is a little bit cumbersome to be holding this whole time. One of the biggest cons of the Chansey pattern is that there's not pictures throughout the pattern to help you with crocheting things until you get to the assembly page. That was super helpful, knowing exactly where things needed to be placed and what it needed to look like, knowing the orientation things should be facing and so on. Those pictures were all really, really helpful, but I think that having photos on the crochet pages as well would have also been a good idea and helpful for determining what things are supposed to be looking like after you crochet them. My next note is about the facial embroidery. My face is embroidered differently than the pattern designers, and that is mostly due to the mouth. I wanted to have a mouth that was like more open and a smile than the photos of the finished product by the pattern designer were. I think the facial expression there was more of like a grin instead of like a open mouth smile. One of my next comments about the pattern is just about the size in general. I wish that somewhere in the pattern before you started it, it would tell you the measurements of the final product using the materials that the designer used. That way, if you're using similar materials or bigger materials, just imagine making this in Bernat yarn, it would have been huge. It's already huge as it is. That way you would know what it's supposed to come out looking like, how big it's supposed to be, and that sort of thing. And also you might be able to gauge how much time you would be investing in making this plushie. And so typically that's not something that I would note in most patterns. I think it's a plus, maybe a good marketing tool to tell people when your pattern is quick and easy to make. But having this pattern be as large as it is, I think it would be really beneficial to tell the people who are potentially going to make your pattern how big it's going to turn out in the end. So all that being said, I still think the pattern is really cute, and it's seriously one of the biggest plushies, biggest projects I've ever worked on in amigurumi. And because of that, I think it's a really impressive pattern. It really comes out looking like it does in the pattern photos, which is always a plus. I'm running into more and more patterns recently that are like catfishing me, unfortunately. So I'm always really happy to have a finished product that looks like the photos. So with all that being said, I would give this pattern 4 stars out of 5. It's a great pattern, and you should definitely check it out if you have 4.5-ish hours laying around that you want to make something giant like this. The next pattern that I made for this video is Perry the Platypus by Crafts. This is Perry the Platypus, obviously, and this is a character that appeared in Phineas and Ferb. Also around kind of like my age demographic when we were growing up, this was one of the shows that was coming on in the Disney Channel. If you're unfamiliar with it, he is a secret agent platypus. So he has like his little hat that he wears, and he stands up on his back legs when he is the secret agent, like walking around like a human. When he's not, he does not wear his hat, and he's just like a pet platypus of the main characters of the show. First thing that I noticed about the pattern was that whenever there was a repeat, it didn't tell you how many times you're supposed to repeat. I assume you're just supposed to repeat until the end of the row. And because of that, it might be a little bit confusing because you don't know how many times you're supposed to repeat something. So you may come to the end of the row and have just the right amount of stitches, but you could have an incorrect stitch count because of a previous row, and you might not have noticed it because that repeat doesn't tell you how many times you repeat it. Next up, I wanted to give kudos about having photos throughout the pattern to display what you're supposed to do in each important step where things might be a little bit more complicated, and the assembly section, all of that. I wanted to point that out because there's been a lot of patterns in this video, nearly all of them, I feel like, that did not have photos during the progress of the pattern so that you know that you're doing things correctly. That's really important to visual learners, and I just wanted to commend this pattern designer for making sure there were work in progress photos throughout the pattern. The final thing that I wanted to note was just about the tail. If you look at the pattern photos, it looks like the pattern designer's tail is more straight out, whereas if you look at the pattern tester photos, there are some that are like kind of floppy like mine is, or there are some that are straight out. I have no idea how that straight out tail was achieved. I don't know if they put like a piece of cardboard in it to make sure that it stuck out further or like more straight and not as floppy as mine is, or what they did. But yeah, I think you could make this in any color that you want, with or without the hat, and people would recognize that it is a platypus. So definitely keep your eye out for this pattern in the future. I think I'll be making more platypus or platypi, is that the correct term? In the future, not necessarily Perry's, but just like platypi in general. All that being said, I'd give this pattern 4 stars out of 5. It's really cute and really easy to make, and the pattern is great throughout. The next pattern I tested for this video is Chu Totoro. This is a pattern by Danny Magpie, and I actually made this one twice because I wasn't super satisfied how the first one turned out, and I also realized that I had a closer color to Totoro's actual colors in my yarn stash and ended up making a second one, so that is why I did that. For this pattern, it has you make a bag in acrylic yarn, so you could potentially make it in the same type of yarn that you make Totoro in, but the bag might come out a lot bigger than you're expecting it to. I also really like the texture difference of the bag compared to the body. It really makes it stand out, and it really adds a lot more character. So I really like that a lot. Big notes about this pattern are that the body is crocheted in one piece, the arms and legs are bobble stitches, and you have to crochet the tail, ears, and bag, and potentially the eye pieces separately. Part of the hesitation on those eye pieces are that I kind of improvised them. It wants you to cut out felt and stick your safety eyes through them to attach them to the body, but instead I just opted for crocheting some white circles for the eyes just because I don't have any felt lying around, so that's why I did that. The next thing that I noticed in this pattern was that whenever there was a repeat row, it was just written again. It wasn't written like rows 9 through 10 do this. It was written 9 instructions and then 10 the same instructions. So I thought that was a little weird. I think that if those repeats were written as repeats instead of as just supplement rows that have the same instructions, it would save a little room on the pages and you would be able to show the photos a little bit bigger, which might have been helpful for people who might have trouble seeing photos on smaller screens. My next note is that I wish that there were better instructions on how to crochet the half triangle shapes on Totoro's chest. As you can see on this one, it looks a little better than the first version. What I did to achieve this was I started with the first one. I embroidered that half triangle on there, and then I did the other 2 separately, and I just made sure that that one is centered, and then I just used the space that was left over to create the other 2. For the greenish one that I have here, I started from the left or right side, I can't remember, but I did not start in the center, and because of that there wasn't enough room in the center to create the half triangle on the same level as the other 2. So I think at some point I'm going to go back, cut these embroidery pieces off, and then just redo it so that it looks a little bit cleaner, because obviously this one looks a lot better and a lot nicer than this one does, and it's just because that embroidery is very messy on this one. The next thing that I'm going to note is about the bag. The pattern tells you to use a 4.5mm hook with your acrylic yarn, but I ended up using a 3mm hook instead, just to match the yarn weight that I had available, and that is just something you're going to have to keep in an account for when you create things with different sized yarn. I don't think my yarn probably matched up perfectly with the pattern designer's acrylic yarn, which is why I opted for a smaller hook size. Anyway, I really liked the pattern. There were lots of diagrams, photos, graphics, all that sort of thing to make it really easy to make this little guy. Even where I had issues, I was able to figure out what I could do to make it a little bit better, and that is why I'm going to give this pattern 4.5 stars out of 5. The last pattern I made for this video is the Swee from Pal World. Pal World is a similar concept as Pokemon, but it's like an open world parody of Pokemon that came out, I believe last year or early this year. It's still in early access, but yeah, it was a super popular game earlier this year, and my husband actually is getting into playing it again because there have been some updates where there's like a new island, new pals, all sorts of things. Anyway, the Swee is one of the earlier pals that you encounter, and it kind of looks like a ghost, and it has like cat ears and a little tail on the back. But yeah, so this is the Swee. One of the first thing that I noticed was that there was an inner gray part of the ear in the photos, but there wasn't any mention of embroidering that gray part on or making a separate gray part on in the pattern, like crocheting a separate part of the ears. There's just one part of the ear and you make it in the blue color. Because of that, I ended up embroidering some of that gray on to make it look a little bit similar to the final pattern photos. So what I did was I just embroidered on the front layer of the stitches so that you wouldn't be able to see that gray on the back of the ears. The next thing that I noticed was that those ears looked a lot bigger in the photos than they do on my final product. I think it might have to do with the yarn weight of the pattern designer being larger. Mine must have been a little bit smaller and my tension might have been a little bit tighter. Next note is again about having photos throughout the pattern to show you how to do different steps, and this really was detrimental in the assembly section and as well as just making different pieces, like all these smaller pieces. I think it would have been helpful to have photos of what they looked like when they were finished being made, and having assembly photos is also always super important so that you know where they're being sewn on. Major thing for me was these little flap parts on the side of the Swee's head. They're actually supposed to be sewn on like back behind the ears, and that wasn't super obvious to me. There's also a YouTube video that goes along with this pattern, and I took a peek at it after I finished the written pattern, and I still noticed that there's not even a voiceover in the video. So those instructions are just written instructions that appear on the screen, and they don't have any extra detail about them in the video themselves, so it doesn't tell you where to position them. It just kind of shows you, and you're just supposed to figure it out on your own instead of knowing that it's supposed to be located behind the ear instead of like in line with the ear. The main problem that I had with that instruction was just that in the pattern it tells you to sew them on under the ears, and I took that as like directly under the ears instead of under and behind. So all that being said, I think it's still a really cute pattern, and you can tell if you're familiar with Pal World that it is supposed to be a Swee. I think it can also be mistaken as like a ghost wearing a kitty costume, so it's a good plushie to have at your markets in the fall. But all that being said, I think I would give this pattern 3.5 stars out of 5. It's got a little bit to go to get to that more great tier instead of kind of like the mid tier of patterns and how patterns go. There's just some little things there that I think can be improved upon to make sure that the pattern is as good as it can be and can be replicated every time pretty accurately. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really liked picking out a bunch of character patterns. I had a lot saved up over the past year that I wanted to get to. A lot of these pattern suggestions have been sitting around for a while, and I just really wanted to get enough character patterns that I could do a character themed pattern review video. So that is why it took a while to get around to some of these suggestions. But anyway, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you found a pattern here that you want to try for yourself. If you did, let me know in the comments down below which pattern you are going to try, and let me know if you have tried any of these patterns already and your thoughts on them as well. And also, always feel free to call me out if there's something that I missed, if I said, oh, I don't like this about the pattern, and actually I just missed something. I'm always happy to hear your feedback about my feedback in case I missed something, or I'm just not being super accountable about making sure that my feedback is warranted and, accurate. Anyway, I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and you can also hit the notification bell if you want to be notified every single time that I upload a new video. And with that being said, YouTube thinks you might like this video next, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!